If you're ever at the cathedral in Newcastle upon Tyne, you might find the standards that were laid to rest there after the First World War. One of them is a little different from the rest. It looks like all of the others, and it did come from an infantry battalion, but this battalion was made up of sailors, not soldiers, as this was the standard of a battalion of the Royal Naval Division. Britain began the First World War with the only all-volunteer professional army in Europe. They had been trained to the point where they were man for man, a match for anybody. But, as Napoleon is reported to have said, quantity has a quality all of its own. The Kaiser considered them to be a contemptible little army, which they adopted as their nickname, the Old Contemptibles. The French army could muster over 1 million men. The Germans had a total of 850,000 men already under arms, and could, in a matter of days, could mobilise 4,300,000 in 25 active army corps. Even the Belgian army could muster 350,000 men, if all of the garrison and fortress troops were included. The British Expeditionary Force sent to France was only 160,000 men, making about the same size as the army of Serbia. This is not because they were holding back either. The man in charge, General Wilson, was well known for his love of France and wanted the entire British army across the Channel when they called for aid. The Royal Navy, on the other hand, was massive. Like the army, it was entirely made up of volunteers, but it combined quality with quantity. From 1889, they followed the two-power standard, making it a matter of policy to maintain a fleet as large as the next two great powers combined. This changed in 1909 to focus on Britain's most important great power rival, the Germans. The new idea was to keep a fleet 60% larger than the German High Seas Fleet, but in 1914 there were still 146,000 sailors in the fleet, backed up by a large volunteer reserve. These were drawn from all stratas of society by a sense of patriotic duty and the prospect of a retainer, which was paid quarterly. Even barristers at the Inns of Court in London formed a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve detachment who drilled in the gardens and had a gun mounted at Victoria Embankment to fire at German aircraft. If you're wondering why Britain had chosen to reduce from the two-power standard to focus solely on the Germans, the reason is cost. Battleships are expensive. They're expensive to build, they're expensive to man, and they are expensive to run. During the annual manoeuvres, the Grand Fleet consumed 16,000 tons of coal every single day. So, the British government came up to an agreement to share the burden of securing the seas with their old enemies, the French. This was the Anglo-French Naval Agreement of 1912. The British agreed to concentrate on the North Sea against the Germans, leaving it up to the French to police the Mediterranean. It was a controversial policy. Cabinet debated it for 3 months. These debates led to Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, into shouting matches with some of his cabinet colleagues, such as Morley, who accused him of attempting to create an alliance for war. Churchill replied that he had a political preamble inserted in order to make it clear that the British had no obligation to fight in a French war. So when that war came in 1914, it split opinion in Cabinet. They would not go to war for France, but they agreed that they would be willing to enter the war if there was a substantial violation of Belgian neutrality, and then only by a single vote. When the German army swung through Belgium, it not just shattered the Belgian defences, it also shattered the anti-war faction within Cabinet. 4 ministers resigned. 2 of whom later rejoined, but by then Britain had committed to throwing itself into the continental meat grinder. General Wilson activated his pre-war plans to send the entire British army to France to reinforce the left wing of the French army and nowhere else. He didn't spare any troops to help reinforce Belgium, the country that Britain had actually gone to war to protect. He didn't even leave any spare troops to defend Britain itself. At first, the Great War looked like it was going to be a fast-paced land war, given the speed of the German advances. But this was when Winston Churchill looked at the Royal Navy Reserve men, who had been called up even before the Royal Proclamation, and he had one of his ideas. These men had expected that if a war came, they would be fighting on ships, where they'd be well fed and have a comfortable hammock with warm blankets at night. They did train with rifle and bayonet, to the point that some R&V officers complained about the amount of mud crushing that they did, but they had volunteered to fight at sea. Instead, Churchill took men from the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, stokers from the Royal Fleet Reserve, seamen from the Royal Naval Reserve, and formed them into the Royal Naval Division. The R&D would fight on land, like the Naval Brigade that had been sent to relieve Ladysmith during the Second World War. 8 battalions were formed, each named after a famous naval figure. These were Anson, Benbow, Collingwood, Drake, Hawke, Howe, Hood and Nelson, plus a brigade of Royal Marines. The Marines, as they were already trained and prepared for land warfare, were immediately dispatched to Ostend. The Naval Brigade were mustered and drilled at Crystal Palace. While there, they even managed to acquire themselves a band made up of lads from the training ship Arethusa. The Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve officers were supplemented by the retired naval officers, plus some army officers who had been led by the Brigade of Guards and the Indian Army, to give the force some experience of fighting on land. When this was not enough, a call was put out for suitable men to volunteer as officers in the RMVR. In Hawke Battalion, the only instructors they had were 4 former Marine sergeants, one of whom had been a postman for the last 12 years. They had been trained to man the great guns of the fleet, but this had been abandoned to concentrate on using rifles instead. The RMVR were instructed to bring along their own rifles from their drill ships. These were the older, now obsolete type of Lee Enfield that had been used during the Second World War. To go with this, they were given old leather equipment that had also been last used during the Second World War. It had been stored in cellars and barracks from the beginning of the century, and would have dried out until it was hard as iron and covered in mildew. It took them hours cleaning it before it was made presentable. It was worn with traditional sailor square rig uniform, although they had been promised khaki uniforms that would make them less conspicuous on the fields of Belgium. They marched out of Crystal Palace towards the Dover Road behind their band of training ship boys, still in their blue sailors' uniform with obsolete rifles and ancient equipment. Then they boarded the trains that would take them to war. The crossing was uneventful. Although Hawke Battalion did get lost marching through the outskirts of Antwerp, they slept in a ditch that night before finally reaching their positions. When they got there, they were told to dig trenches, but they didn't have any entrenching tools. So they had to borrow picks and shovels from neighbouring farmhouses, while the former Marines went around trying to make sure that everybody actually knew how to use their rifles. Despite all of this, the R&D did help the Belgian army delay the German advance, but High Command knew that they would never be able to stop it. The 2nd Brigade, Marine Brigade and the 1st Brigade of Drake Battalion received orders to withdraw. They marched for 13 hours to get on a train to Ostend. By the time the rest of the Royal Naval Division heard anything, the route back had been cut off. The Dutch border was only 5 miles away, so some officers thought they could walk through the neutral country so long as they were out again in 24 hours, because this was the rule for ships in a neutral port. They soon learned that things worked differently on land, and that as soon as they set foot over the border, they were being turned. Sub-Lieutenant Grant of Drake Battalion refused, and was placed under arrest by his superior officer. He managed to hang back until the arresting officer had crossed the border. Being turned meant that he had surrendered his authority, which meant that Grant was no longer under arrest and could head for the coast. Lieutenant West of Hawke Battalion also decided not to be interned. He led 40 men towards up the coast. On their way, they found a dozen men of Benbow Battalion who got lost and spent the night in a local church. These too would also find their way to Ostend. The defence of Antwerp was seen as a fiasco in Britain. 37 officers and 1,442 men marched across the border into the Netherlands to be interned at Groningen. Another 5 officers and 931 men had been captured during the retreat. It only delayed the German troops by 5 or 6 days, but this did allow the Belgians to secure the roads to the Channel ports. Churchill came in for a lot of criticism, as it should have been his idea. The force that he had said had been too small and too undertrained. With the benefit of hindsight, even Churchill himself admitted the surplus would have been absorbed into the fleet by early 1915. However, now the division had been formed, it was not disbanded. The survivors were mustered at Crystal Palace, where they finally got the khaki uniforms that they'd been promised. Then it was off to Gallipoli. After the Allied withdrawal from Gallipoli, they were sent to France, and continued to fight all the way up until the armistice of 1918. I'll come back to what happened during these campaigns later, but next time I'm going to talk about another naval unit that you might not have expected, which was in Belgium at the start of